Same as you're not being told about niacin, you're not being told about the many other, the myriad of nutritional substances that can help with cognitive function. And you have to remember, a lot of mental health disorders are cognitively related, okay? Whether people believe that or not. Now, before I get started, I am not a doctor of any kind. I'm not a physician of any kind. I'm not a DO. I'm not an MD. I'm not an ND. I'm not a chiropractor. I'm not a nurse. I'm not an LPN. I'm not an RN. I'm not a nurse practitioner. I'm not a dietitian. I'm not a nutritionist. This video does not constitute medical advice. If you have a medical question or a medical concern, talk to somebody with a medical license and a medical degree. I am not such a person. So we're going to move on here. So background and aim, mental health is becoming, now what you have to understand is schizophrenia, which is the most horrific, people think it's the most horrific of the mental health issues, is in reality, the symptoms are those of a dementia. Dementia affects cognition, which is why people with schizophrenic symptoms tend to have a symptom of delusional thinking, which is a form of dementia. Dementia coming from the word demented. So if you have dementia, your thinking is demented. So 6 independent reviewers evaluated articles on the inclusion results. 96 articles were summarized in the narrative, blah, 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 were included alpha-lipoic acid, bacopa, mononeri, B vitamins, cholinergic precursors, vitamin D, vitamin E, ginkgo biloba, ginseng, lion's mane mushroom, N-acetylcysteine, omega-3 fatty acids, allopolysaccharides, Rohidia rosea, which is red tea. It comes from Africa. Rosemary, saffron, tart cherries, turmeric, wild yam, withania, somnifera, xanthines, and zinc. Particularly noteworthy effects on cognition included memory, recollection, attention, intelligence, vocabulary, recognition, response, inhibition, arousal, performance enhancement, planning, creative thinking, reaction time, vigilance, task switching, orientation to time, place, and person, reading, writing, comprehension, accuracy, learning, information processing, speed, executive function, mental flexibility, daily functioning, decrease in mental fatigue, and freedom from distractibility. Some nutrients and phytonutrients also improved mood. Now notice some of those symptoms. Do any of those symptoms sound familiar to you? Like, for example, rigidity in thinking. Will these help promote mental flexibility? Slow cognitive processing. These improve cognitive processing speed. They increase executive functioning. Okay, they reduce mental fatigue. So for people with ADHD that have mental fatigue and are easily distracted. Okay, some nutrients and phytonutrients also improved mood. So, for example, depression things, and contentedness and reduced anxiety, and the need for caregiving. These effects are not completely consistent or ubiquitous across all patient populations or health statuses. Adverse effects were minimal or non-existent. So they were minimal or non-existent. Conclusion: due to the growing population of people with cognitive impairment and lack of effective pharmacotherapies or pharmacotherapeutics, it is prudent for those afflicted or their caregivers to find alternative treatments. Our narrative review shows that many of these nutrients and phytonutrients may be promising for treating some aspects of cognitive impairment, especially for people afflicted with AD, which is Alzheimer's disease. So, especially for people afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. Relevance for patients is demonstrated in a number of clinical trials. Healthy adults and patients with various health challenges, Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease, exhibiting a wide range of severity and cognitive defects, would be best served to consider multiple nutrients and phytonutrients to improve. So keep that in mind. Remember Dr. Bruce Ames's triage theory. So they would be best to look into multiple nutrients and phytonutrients to improve aspects of their cognitive function. Now, keep in mind, what you also need to keep in mind is the Younger You diet, that's Kara Fitzgerald's diet, and Dr. Sandra Kaufman's protocol, and of course Dr. Terry Walls's protocol. Now, the Younger You protocol, the Younger You program, and the Walls protocol are so extremely similar. It's almost it's very interesting, and I would recommend people read both of those books, the Walls protocol and Younger You. But I would also highly encourage people to read Dr. Sandra Kaufman's book. Okay, so moving on here. So this is an overview of the misuse of psychiatry, okay? So Senator Goldwater testified that he was extremely upset, blah, 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 blah. So Dr. Goldwater was erroneously deemed unfit to hold office by a bunch of liberal kooks that happened to be psychiatrists, okay? So in 1964, both the APA and the AMA were upset after 1,189 psychiatrists stated publicly in the now defunct magazine Fact, the name of the magazine should give it away, that Senator Barry Goldwater was psychologically unfit to be president of the United States because they were liberals that didn't want a conservative running. Okay, I can only imagine what they'd think of George Wallace without having examined him. So they made this determination without even examining him. Many psychiatrists commented on his psychological state, such as his mental instability stems from the fact that his father was and his mother was a Protestant. This ethnic and cultural split accounts for feelings of insecurity and spiritual loneliness. Others compared him with the Big H, Stalin, and Castro. Okay, Senator Goldwater later testified that he was extremely upset. Now, keep in mind, all three of those people are vehemently conservative. They don't like conservatives. They don't like conservatives whether they're on the left or the so-called left. The Stalin was not on the left, but, whatever. My point is, they don't like conservatives. Senator Goldwater later testified that he was extremely upset by the article, noting that a smile from strangers now had a different meaning. Not only did he lose the election in a landslide, but the article also caused him harm. In 1973, the APA responded by promulgating the Goldwater Rule. It is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. According to the APA, these unauthorized opinions are unethical on multiple incontrovertible grounds. Okay, so this would be kind of like my therapist coming to conclusions not based on her examination of me, but based on YouTube videos. Or, I don't know, maybe it wasn't her that came to those conclusions. Maybe it was the higher-ups that are also therapists that came to these unethical conclusions based on YouTube videos and third-hand knowledge instead of examining me. Okay. Much has been noted about the ethics infractions associated with the Goldwater Rule, blah, blah, blah. Psychiatry in this country has also committed abuses in service to society. Duh. The 19th century case of Elizabeth Packard, a married woman who was committed to a Jacksonville asylum in Illinois after being diagnosed with moral insanity for disobeying her husband and harboring alternate religious beliefs. So this is what you have to understand about mental health. Mental health is an opinion. It is completely subjective. Okay? There is no objectivity to what these people are saying. So this woman was diagnosed with moral insanity and disobeying her husband and harboring alternate religious beliefs from her husband. In a prime example, at the hospital, she encountered many other women who had suffered a similar fate. hospitalized for decades at the behest of their husbands and acquaintances of psychiatrists for questionable psychiatric reasons. Here psychiatry was used for social control, and it still is. I am a victim of this very sort of thing because I refuse to express a liberal viewpoint. I was ostracized by militant feminists. The shameful misuse of psychiatry extends back to antebellum America, when psychiatrists diagnosed African Americans to maintain the social order of enslavement and used black patients to care for white patients. Of particular interest was Benjamin Rush, considered the father of American psychiatry, who believed that black skin was a mild form of leprosy. Keep this in mind. This is how idiotic these people are. This is the father of the, quote, medical model, believed that dark skin was a mild form of leprosy, and he called it nigritude, which could be cured only by becoming white. Think about that. This is how idiotic this guy is. An apprentice of his, Samuel Cartwright, coined the diagnosis drapetomania, a mental illness that caused black slaves to flee captivity. So this is the mentality of psychiatry. Depending on the social environment, it completely alters the subjectivity of the matter, okay? Okay, so let's see here. In the diagnosis of a patient admitted to the Central Lunatic Asylum in Petersburg, Virginia, raises an important question about whether black patients were overdiagnosed with severe mental illness, as they have been in modern times. In addition, numerous references can be found to the hypothesis that mental illness in the black population increased substantially with the end of slavery. Psychiatry is the only subspecialty of medicine in which the casual pronouncement by practitioners can strip individuals of their human... Keep this in mind. Where the casual pronouncement, they're not doing any testing or anything. They're just like, hey, you got this. But it strips individuals of their humanity, of their dignity, of their respect, and their liberty. Okay? It is little wonder, therefore, that individuals or governments with ulterior motives would strive to use psychiatry for their own ends, because the risk of the unethical misuse of psychiatry is ever present, and its consequences so devastating, psychiatrists must remain on guard against it. Yeah, So this is the gentleman that wrote this. Moving forward. Many years back, I was in a county meeting, and they were talking about how to tackle homophobia in the clients of the various places, about how horrible homophobia was and blah, blah, blah. And I had voiced concern that, you can't dictate to clients what their morality is, okay? And I used the example of global warming. Are we going to start locking people up for quote-unquote global warming denial? And one of the people at the meeting half-jokingly said, well, yes, and you shouldn't, but the point was they were half-joking. They weren't fully joking. The point that I would like to make is that what you see right now is, with social norms changing, with the Overton window going all the way to the left, okay, you're seeing the changing of psychiatry from being hyper-conservative. It's never objective. See, this is the thing. What you have to understand with psychiatry, mental health, all this crap, this is not objective. This is completely subjective. So you see it from going from a conservative society where people with liberal views were erroneously locked up, erroneously sterilized, erroneously medicated, erroneously what have you. Not erroneously, they really were abused, they really were sterilized, these things did happen to them, but in the name of social conservatism. Well, now you see a similar thing, if not the exact same thing, happening in the name of liberalism. if you believe homosexuality is immoral, if you believe transgenderism is immoral, if you believe that, whatever, if you believe that global warming is a fraud and you can show evidence that it is, you might be psychotic, according to these people. And that's just the way they use psychiatry as a political weapon. Of course, psychiatry has been being used as a political weapon for many, 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 many years. Since its birth, it's been a political weapon. So political abuse of psychology or psychiatry, also commonly referred to as punitive psychiatry. Think about this when people are forced to take neurotoxins as the result of sentencing. Is the misuse of psychiatry, including diagnosis, detention, and treatment for the purpose of obstructing the human rights of individuals and or groups in society. In other words, abuse of psychiatry, including that for political purposes, is the deliberate action of having citizens psychiatrically diagnosed who need neither psychiatric restraint nor psychiatric treatment. Psychiatrists have been involved in human rights abuses in states across the world. When the definitions of mental disease were expanded to include political disobedience, keep that in mind, they were expanded to include political disobedience. As scholars have long argued, governmental and medical institutions code menaces to authority as mental diseases. So they code menaces to authority as mental diseases. Now, think about oppositional defiant disorder, for example. Nowadays, in many countries, political prisoners are sometimes confined and abused in psychiatric hospitals. Psychiatry possesses a built-in capacity for abuse that is greater than in other areas of medicine. The diagnosis of mental disease allows the state to hold persons against their will and insist upon therapy in their interest and in the broader interests of society. Psychiatry can be used to bypass standard legal procedures, meaning they can lock you up even if you're innocent, which is what they tried to do to me when I initially went there. They tried to 302 me, which they failed, but they tried to 302 me and said I was having persecutory delusions regarding the harassment online that they now believe, that never happened. They always believed me, okay? So the fact of the matter is, they had tried to bypass legal procedures to get me locked up, to shut me up. The use of hospitals instead of jails also prevents the victims from receiving legal aid. Because this is the funny thing. You're allowed to see your lawyer whenever you want as long as the psychiatrist deems it reasonable. Okay? Which could be never. The victims from receiving legal aid before the courts in some countries make indefinite incarceration possible and discredits the individuals and their ideas. In that manner, whenever open trials are undesirable, because these aren't open trials, these are closed trials, okay, they are avoided. The political abuse, like when you're 302, that is a closed trial. That is not an open trial. That's not taking place in a courtroom. The political abuse of the power entrusted to physicians, and particularly psychiatrists, has long and abundant history. For example, during the Nazi era and the Soviet rule, when religious and political dissenters were labeled as mentally ill and subjected to inhumane treatments in the period from the 1960s up to 1986, abuse of psychiatry for political and ideological purposes was reported to be systemic in the Soviet Union and occasional in other Eastern European countries, such as Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The practice of incarceration of religious and political dissidents, like we're seeing now in this country, and psychiatric hospitals in the Eastern Bloc and the former USSR, damaged the credibility of psychiatric practice in these states and entailed strong condemnation from the international community. Political abuse of psychiatry also takes place in the People's Republic of China. Psychiatric diagnoses such as the diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia and political dissidents in the USSR were used for political purposes by country. The duplicitous orphans were several thousand orphan children that were falsely certified as mentally ill by the government of the province of Quebec, Canada, and confined to psychiatric institutions. Donald Ewan Cameron's operation was running from what is today known as the Allen Memorial Institute, part of the Royal Victoria Hospital, and not to be confused with the non-governmental organization based in Montreal, China. In 2002, Human Rights Watch published the book Dangerous Minds, Political Psychiatry in China Today and Its Origins in the Mao Era, written by Ruben Munro, and based on the documents obtained by him. The British researcher Robin Munro, a sinologist, meaning a guy that studies China, who was writing his dissertation in London after a long sojourn in China, had traveled to China several times to survey libraries in provincial towns. While he was there, he had gathered a large amount of literature which bore the stamp secret, but at the same time it was openly available. This literature even included historical analyses which were published during the Cultural Revolution, and it concerned articles and reports on the number of people who were taken to mental hospitals because they complained about a series of issues. It was found, according to Munro, that the involuntary confinement of religious groups, political dissidents, and whistleblowers, such as Falun Gong today, people should look up the word Falun Gong or Falun Dafa, had a long history in China. The abuses began in the 1950s and 60s, blah, blah, blah. During the period Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, the political abuse of psychiatry reached its apogee in China, which was then under the rule of Mao Zedong and the Gang of Four, who established a very repressive and harsh regime. No deviance or opposition was tolerated. So keep that in mind. This is a hyper-conservative regime in communist China under Mao Zedong. So, like in the U.S., the psychiatry is being used to enforce conservative social norms, okay? Now it's being used in the United States to enforce liberal social norms. The documents described the massive abuses of psychiatry that were committed for political purposes during the rule of Mao, when millions of people were declared mentally sick. In the 1980s, according to official documents, 15% of all forensic psychiatric cases had political connotations. Okay? Official Chinese psychiatric literature distinctly testifies that the Communist Party's notion of political dangerousness was institutionally engrafted as the main concept in the diagnostic armory of China's psychiatry. Okay, despite international criticism, China seems to be continuing its political abuse of psychiatry. The abuses there, high on the agenda, blah, blah, blah. The political abuses there appear to be even more widespread than they were in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s, and they involve the incarceration of petitioners, human rights workers, trade union activists, members of the Falun Gong movement, and people who complain about injustices that have been committed against them by local authorities. It also seems that China had no known high security forensic institutions. So this is similar to what the county of Bucks has been trying to do to me, because I complained about abuse by Lenape Valley. So you see how it works. We're not really that far different from China. It's just, our people kind of look at you with a smile. It also seems that China had no known high security forensic institutions until 1989. However, since then, the Chinese authorities have, now I've been saying this for years, I've been saying, we are a hop, skip, and a jump from the abuse of psychiatry to the level of the USSR and Nazi Germany, or in this case, Communist China. The political abuse of psychiatry in China only seems to take place in the institutions which are under the authority of the police, blah, blah, blah. China structure, Cuba. Now, mind you, I've also been harassed by a detective at the behest of this agency without any reason. There was no reason for the harassment. I've received false calls from police that were not police, or at least they didn't give me their badge number when I asked for it. They just called me, threatened me, and hung up. They threatened me with unreasonable threats, such as a warrant would be issued for my arrest when a police officer could not issue such a warrant. So I have received the same kind of treatment I would receive in communist China, except it's a little different here because there's a little bit more in the way of safeguards. But if those safeguards were removed, and they could be, we are turning quickly into an authoritarian state that we have already weaponized. Psychiatry has been weaponized. Mental health has been weaponized since the beginning by the people in power. The people in power now are using it to enforce their crazy ideas. Cuba. Although Cuba has been politically connected to the Soviet Union since the United States broke off relations with Cuba shortly after Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, few considerable allegations regarding the political abuse of psychiatry in this country emerged before the late 1980s. Okay, America's Watch and Amnesty International published reports alluding to this. Cuba's wacky with what they did. Published, as are a lot of other Latin American countries, published reports alluding to cases of possible unwarranted hospitalization and ill treatment of political prisoners. These reports concerned the Gustavo Manchin Hospital in Santiago de Cuba, in the southeast of the country, and the major mental hospital in Havana. In 1977, a report on alleged abuse of psychiatry in Cuba presenting cases of ill treatment in mental hospitals going back to the 1970s came out in the United States. It presents grave allegations that prisoners end up in the forensic ward of mental hospitals in Santiago de Cuba and Havana, where they undergo ill treatment, including electroconvulsive therapy without muscle relaxants or anesthesia. Okay, well, so did Americans a while back. The reported application of ECT in the forensic ward seems, at least in many of the cited cases, not to be an adequate clinical treatment for the diagnosed state of the prisoner. I guarantee you, if you really looked into it in America, you'd see that it's not really supported by any evidence either. Okay, in some cases, the prisoners seem not to have been diagnosed at all. Conditions in the forensic wards have been described in repulsive terms and apparently are in striking contrast to the other parts of the mental hospitals that are said to be well-kept and modern. And that's another thing that you have to understand. Cuba is actually interesting in the sense that they actually have an army of doctors. It's part of their constitution, I believe, actually, that they have modern science and modern medicine. They have extremely modern medicine and extremely modern science in Cuba, despite the primitive nature of the rest of the country. The scientific sector and the medical sector is excessively modern. The Marxist historian Ariel Helgago was apprehended and accused of incitement against the social order in 1981. In September 1981, he was transported to the state security headquarters in Corbo Sarvia Forensic Ward of Havana Psychiatric Hospital, where he stayed for several weeks. Germany. By 1936, killing of the physically and socially unfit, and believe me, that has happened, well, not killing, but the forced sterilization of the physically and socially unfit was a thing in the United States. So people might go, well, you're a eugenist, don't you support that? No, I do not. I support positive eugenics. What I support is simply encouraging people to find mates that they believe will help them have the healthiest, smartest, and most suitable children possible. I do not believe that the government can be involved in eugenics after the atrocities that have been committed in the name of eugenics. I don't believe in negative eugenics. I don't believe in forced sterilization. I don't believe in forced abortion. I don't believe in any of that. I certainly don't believe in forced killing of people. By 1936, killing of the physically and socially unfit became accepted practice in Nazi Germany. In the 1940s, the abuse of psychiatry involved the abuse of the duty to care on an enormous scale. 300,000 individuals were involuntarily sterilized and 77,000 murdered in Germany alone, and many thousands further afield. Mainly in Eastern Europe, psychiatrists were instrumental in establishing a system of identifying, notifying, transporting, and killing hundreds of thousands of racially and cognitively compromised persons and the mentally ill in settings that ranged from centralized mental hospitals to jails and death camps. Psychiatrists played a central role and prominent role in the sterilization and euthanasia, constituting two categories of crimes against humanity. The taking of thousands of brains from euthanasia victims demonstrated the way medical research was connected to the psychiatric killings. Germany operated 6 psychiatric extermination centers: Bernburg, Brandenburg, Grafenegg, Hadamar, Hartheim, and Sonnenstein. They played a crucial role in the developments leading to the Holocaust. India. It was reported that the Indian government has approached blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm going to get to Japan. Japanese psychiatric hospitals during the country's imperial era reported an abnormally large number of patient deaths, peaking in 1945 after the surrender to Allied forces. The patients of these institutions were mistreated, mainly because they were considered a hindrance to society under imperial Japanese government. Citizens were expected to contribute in one way or another to the war effort, and the mentally ill were unable to do so, and as such they were looked down upon and abused. The main cause of death for these patients was starvation, as caretakers did not supply the patients with adequate food, likely as a form of torture and a method of sedation. Because mentally ill patients were kept secluded from the outside world, a large number of deaths went unnoticed by the general public. After the end of the Allied occupation, the National Diet of Japan passed the Mental Hygiene Act, which improved the status of the mentally ill and prohibited the domestic containment of mental patients in medical institutions. However, the Mental Hygiene Act had unforeseen consequences. Along with many other reforms, the law prevented the mentally ill from being charged with any sort of crime. In Japanese courts, anyone who was found to be mentally unstable by a qualified psychiatrist was required to be hospitalized rather than incarcerated. Norway. There have been a few accusations about abuse of psychiatry in Norway. Most of it was forced sterilization. Romania, there have been allegations of this is just former Eastern Bloc countries, Russia, Soviet Union. I'll get into that more in depth later. Suriname, Thailand. The United States, this goes into the abuse of African Americans, in addition, inventing in the United States, political dissenters have been involuntarily committed. For example, in 1927, demonstrator named Ora D'Angelo was sent to a mental health facility for psychiatric evaluation after she participated in a rally to support Sacco and Vanzetti, who were two commies. Now, what you have to understand, I know they were anarchists, though. But what you have to understand is that you're seeing psychiatry, no matter what, is used to support the views of those in power. It's weaponized by those in power. At this time, those in power were conservatives. At this time now, they're ferociously liberal. So what you're seeing is the use of psychiatry to ostracize, abuse, demonize, and destroy people that are not ferociously liberal, that do not support these ferocious liberal views, these abhorrent things that the liberals support. If you don't support these things, you're considered crazy, which is what has happened to me in many ways. When Glennon W. King Jr., an African-American pastor and activist of the civil rights movement, attempted to enroll in an all-white university for some... Okay, he was considered crazy. This is different abuses. The protest... Okay. In the book, The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, clinical psychologist Bruce E. Levine argues that oppositional defiant disorder, which can be easily used to pathologize anti-authoritarianism. Remind you, I was given the diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder as a youth, and I was prescribed a Haldol for that, which is an antipsychotic, which I don't understand the reasoning there, because I never experienced any form of psychosis, but I was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, which is easily used to pathologize anti-authoritarianism, is a common abuse in psychiatry. California, there are many instances of the usage of California law section 5150, which allows for involuntary psychiatric hold based on the opinion of a law enforcement official. On the opinion of a law enforcement official, psychological professional, or many other individuals who hold no qualification for making a psychological assessment. New York, whistleblowers who part ranks with their organizations have had their mental stability questions, such as, for example, the NYPD veteran Adrian Schulcraft, who was coerced to falsify crime statistics in his department and then became a whistleblower. In 2010, he was forcibly committed to a psychiatric hospital. Moving on. In my next video, I'm going to get into political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, as I find it to really mirror what's going on in the U.S. as of late. And that's all for this video, but in my next video, I'll be talking about political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, and that'll be all for this.